Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and distinguished fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. President Biden is vowing to withhold weapons from Israel if it goes forward with its invasion of Rafah, Hamas's last stronghold in Gaza. Biden told CNN in an interview Wednesday, quote, "Civilians have been killed in Gaza as a consequence of those bombs and other ways in which they go after population centers. I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with that problem." Biden also said the U.S. will continue sending defensive weapons to Israel, but that, quote, "I've made it clear to Bibi and the war cabinet they're not going to get us our support if, in fact, they go on those population centers." Walter, news or faux news?
Actually, I think that's faux news. In that if you parse that statement very carefully, he's saying, the limit on weapons that he wants to send is really quite narrowly drawn. Weapons that have traditionally been used, historically been used for those problems. What is that? That's a category of weapons. If the Israelis are going at Rafah in an unconventional, untraditional way, but also from Israeli sources, I'm hearing that they probably already have enough of what they would need, certainly for the kinds of operations they intend in Rafah, which do not sound like the traditional sort of shock and awe attacks that marked the earlier stages of the Gaza war. So it's not actually clear from that statement that anything that Israel is planning actually to do would trigger or be inhibited by the prohibition that Biden has in the statement. So it sounds a bit like kabuki theater to me. And the assurance that he's going to continue to send defensive weapons also sounds like an assurance to Israel that its concerns about Hezbollah are not being passed unnoticed by this administration. So, we both know that during this whole crisis, Bibi and Biden are doing a kind of a delicate dance, and it's more kabuki than actual policy. It's don't go in there. I'm not going to listen to you. I'm not taking orders from you. Don't go in there. But it's not something they were planning to do anyway. So let's wait and see how it unfolds. But at the moment, I'm definitely leaning to the faux news side here.
All right, our second story. President Biden is betting that $1.6 trillion in climate and infrastructure money can transform America, create green jobs, outcompete China, and maybe catapult him to a second term. But according to a new Politico report, less than 17% of that money has been spent 2 full years after Biden signed the last of the statutes. Only $125 billion has gone out the door under Biden's infrastructure and pandemic relief laws, and less than $700 million of the $54 billion that Congress had made available in the CHIPS and Science Act has been spent, leaving apparent awardees unable to move forward with the construction of projects they've been green-lighted to build. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, news, I suppose, although the people should have known this. I mean, this is, some of us are old enough to remember Obama's shovel-ready infrastructure projects back in his time when Congress whooped through all this money to stop the recession at the time of the financial crisis. But because it is actually so hard for the government to spend money or do anything, the recession was well over before much of the money came online. And Biden is running into some of the same problems. In addition, I think they've sort of larded up a lot of these laws with all kinds of woke requirements, so that under the CHIPS Act, you have to sort of comply with all kinds of things that most sensible tech companies aren't interested in doing. So the higher a price you put on the money that you're offering, the less valuable the money is to the recipient, though the no less costly it is to the taxpayer. So I think they've designed their programs poorly. They fail to understand the importance of these various roadblocks. And the result is that Biden is not getting the kick he hoped he would get.
All right, final story of the week. Prosecutors handling cases from Georgia to Florida to Washington, D.C. are discovering that bringing groundbreaking criminal charges against Donald Trump is a lot easier than getting them to trial. As of now, the wave of prosecutions don't seem destined to deliver the kind of legal accountability that Trump's investigators promised, or the devastating political blow to Trump's presidential prospects. That's because Trump has benefited enormously from a pileup of postponements. After a pair of delays this week in Georgia and Florida, the most likely scenario for 2024 is that the only trial that Trump will face before the election is the ongoing one in Manhattan, the hush money case, which many lawyers view as the least serious of the four, both in terms of the severity of the alleged wrongdoing and the prospect of prison time. Walter, news or faux news?
Is it really news when something that everybody that had a brain thought would happen actually happens? The Democrats have made a terrible hash of these prosecutions. First of all, some of them, including the Stormy Daniels ones, are so clearly political. They just would not be brought against another defendant. I saw Fareed Zakaria actually has said that in his latest post. He's certainly no Trumper. And when a political party persecutes its leading opponent, if this were happening in another country, there would be a big outcry in the United States, regardless of what anybody thought or didn't think about Donald Trump. So you've got, on the one hand, some cases that, at least one of which is moving forward, but which are pretty political. And I think, by the way, on the fraud case in New York, also there's a real sense that there are a lot of real estate deals in New York where somebody inflates the value of a building, but if in fact everybody gets paid off, the loan pays off, it's not normally seen as a matter for the courts. So it's very hard for me to see anything but poor political judgment on these cases. And I think ethical violations, in the sense this is really not the way prosecutors ought to be conducting themselves. On the other cases where I think there is more serious legal issues are at stake, again, they fail to understand that they're trying to sort of do something new with these laws and have them cover areas that haven't been litigated before. These cases are not getting delayed because Donald Trump is a party to them. These cases are delayed because the prosecutors are bringing very novel and controversial legal theories to bear on a particular set of facts. Any lawyer would be go looking at these appeals, and I think any court, regardless of which president's appointed which judges, would look at these issues and say, yeah, actually, these are actual issues because these are very complicated problems of law. So by taking such a long time to bring the indictments, the prosecutors really created a situation in which it is almost certain that none of this stuff can get to court before Election Day. And then that awful situation in Georgia where you have the reason we have this delay is that they're sort of appealing the lower court's decision to let a very, very compromised prosecutor keep her job, keep her role in the case. Again, that's a very appealable issue. No one made her do those stupid things that she did, and no one made her cling to office when it all came out. This is entirely a self-inflicted wound. And for a group of people who claim to believe that Donald Trump is an existential threat to American democracy and must be resisted, at every cost, they are behaving like a bunch of idiots, grammar school kids who have absolutely no idea what they're doing. This display of incompetence, illustrates all of the reasons why a substantial number of Americans are ready to vote for they don't care who, in order to deliver this kind of incompetent but very narcissistic and self-regarding elite a big kick in the pants.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. So a big topic our listeners have probably heard a lot about, but which we've never discussed here on the podcast, Walter, is the global fertility crisis. Nicholas Eberstadt has a new essay out describing the potential social and political and geopolitical consequences of East Asia's projected population decline by 10 to 20% over the next 25 years. In the United States, the birth rate declined an average of 2% every year from 2014 to 2020. And after a brief increase in 2021, it sunk by another 3% in 2022. But this obviously isn't just about the relative generosity of childcare policies. Many of the countries with the most robust childcare, like in Scandinavia and Northern Europe, are also seeing frighteningly low birth rates. So I wanted to ask you, Walter, where does this current crisis kind of fit historically? Is this the kind of periodic panic we've seen throughout history that does end up fixing itself one way or another, or are we really approaching a looming disaster here?
I do think there are good reasons to think this is some sort of natural cycle that will deal with itself somehow. I mean, for one thing, again, we've talked about this in the context of China, I think, where people are saying, "Oh my goodness, their economy is doomed because with the population declining, they're going to have fewer 18-year-old workers," and then immediately flipping around and saying, "Oh my gosh, their economy is doomed because they have such high youth unemployment." The fact is, if you actually think that AI and other forms of automation are going to be wiping out millions of jobs, you can't actually simultaneously believe that a falling birth rate is going to impoverish all and bring civilization to an end. So I'm a little bit, I think historically, falling birth rates have reflected a couple of things. One is better public health means there's less infant mortality, so that my great grandparents had 13 kids and 9 of them lived. The next generation didn't feel the need to have 13, didn't even feel the need to have 9. So that's part of it. Another part is that as people move from the country to the city, children go from being an economic asset to being a significant economic disadvantage. And the same thing to some degree is true of a welfare system, where if you have Social Security and other things for old age, the sort of economically smart thing to do might be to not have kids yourself and let other people's kids pay the bills for your Social Security if you wanted to be a free rider. So a lot of incentives are changing. But I also think there are a lot of forces that are pulling against the centrality of the family. And this is much more complex than getting daycare so that people with two earning parents can both can dump the kids somewhere while they go off to work. Again, you think about the pre-modern typical family, which would have been a rural family where the family is working together, operating together to bring in the food and make the clothes and so on that they all need. And so the attention of the family is very much turned inward. You spend many more hours with your relatives than any of us do today. And so the importance of family was clear. People were not as mobile, not even cars. So most people would often never go more than 30 or 50 miles from their place of birth. So there's a much more family-centric thing. I might even make the point that, especially before birth control, the absence of TV and other forms of evening entertainment just might have an impact on the birth rate. I'll leave it to our readers to figure out the chain of causation that's involved there. So there are all kinds of social changes that are pulling us toward lower birth rates. And the idea that some kind of a subsidy is going to make all of that go away, I think is a little naive. But I would point out that the statistic that, wow, the places that have the highest spending on childcare are also the ones that have lowest birth rates. And maybe there's a little bit of redundancy in that one of the reasons you would start paying a lot for childcare is because you'd begun to worry about the birth rate. Boy, the highest percentage of cancer drugs are taken by people who have cancer. So people spend a lot of time trying to excite themselves emotionally by looking at statistics. So I would say birth rates are declining. I think that's likely to continue. I think a lot of these projections about African birth population levels at the end of the century simply reflect the fact that these changes are coming more slowly to Africa, though I believe they will come. I'd like to see a set of emissions projections that fully reflect the new demographic projections, because if China's population is going to be 20-30% lower than we expect by the end of the century, why surely Chinese emissions would be significantly lower. And I might also point out that old people tend not to generate as many carbon emissions. We're not out there like partying and, sort of the older people tend to be sitting at home quietly. And this is a less carbon intensive way of life. So I think there are a lot of things that everybody knows about the future that are not true. And a number of them are related to demography, but I'm not yet ready to panic and say, oh my gosh, we're going extinct.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Another reader request this week, Walter, this one from Addison in Florida, who wants to know, quote, how do you follow this election or any presidential election intelligently without getting lost in all the nonsense?
All right. Well, honestly, the way to follow any presidential election intelligently is to not pay very much attention to it. And that our ability to forecast the future is, alas, small. And between now and November, a million things will happen. Some of them might move the needle on the election. Some of them might not. Some of them will look like they will, but don't. Some of them will look like they won't, but do. There'll be a lot of chaos. There'll be a lot of noise. There will be millions of pieces, long, carefully reasoned and sourced pieces speculating about why this candidate's going to win and that candidate's going to lose. Again, no one is going to remember any of this 10 minutes after the results are known. It's just all a time suck. I think it is worth sort of checking in on the polls once a week or so just to see if anything has happened. But again, most of us, honestly speaking, we don't follow the election because we have some real need to know who's going to win. We follow the election because it's interesting. It's fun. It's a story. It has good guys and bad guys, or maybe this year it has bad guys and worse guys. I don't know. It's hard to tell. There are a lot of things you can think about. You can have the most wonderful arguments with your friends and your family, but look at the polls from Wisconsin, and on and on and on. And it's, so it's an entertainment. It's maybe it's the intellectuals version of the NFL, or perhaps of professional wrestling. And that's very few people actually want to follow the election news intelligently. Most people want to follow the election news pleasurably. And part of that pleasure is finding out little insights about the election that you can drop on your friends that they haven't thought of yet, and so make you feel extremely cool and well-informed and smart. Narcissism, that's basically why most of us follow elections. It's why most of us do most of what we do. So how can you do that? Which may be maybe I'm underestimating you, but it's perhaps that is the question our reader is asking, our listener. Pay attention to the smart people. Jeremy, I'm a big fan of John Ellis's newsletter. He has in there a weekly sort of poll summary that actually I feel gives a pretty good sense of where the polls are trending in a given week. I tend to stay away myself from those long inside the campaign HQ thumbsuckers. This faction, the reelection campaign, thinks they should do this. This other faction thinks they could. I think that is just, people get paid to write that stuff, but I'm not getting paid to read it, so I'm not. Follow what interests you. Certainly this year, the swing states are interesting. I would say probably the most important question this year is less who wins the presidency than which party controls the Senate. Because if the Democrats end up with the Senate, the House, and the White House, we could see some big changes in the country. Would the District of Columbia become a state, giving two more Senate votes? Would you see an end to the filibuster? If the Democrats aren't dependent on people like Sinema and Manchin for the majority, those could be some real consequential changes that led to greater changes. On the other hand, if you have a Republican Senate, all of those things are off the table, but also there'll be some check on Biden's appointments because the Senate has to confirm them. And on the other hand, if you get a Trump White House, what'll be interesting to see will not be so much the partisan balance between Republicans and Democrats, but the Trump anti-Trump numbers in the Senate. My guess is that Trump, no matter who controls the Senate, Trump will not have a Trumpist majority in the Senate. He'll have a Republican majority. That's a very different thing. And we'd certainly see that when it came to confirmation of officials, other things of that kind. So I would look at things like the Senate race in Pennsylvania. I would also be thinking, by the way, when I think about the Senate, would Trump, if he has a pro-Trump governor or a deal with the governors of some states, would he be likely to appoint Republican senators who are not necessarily in his tight personal circle to cabinet officers and then move the Senate in a more pro-Trump direction? That would be the kind of thing he might well do. We're all going to spend more time than we should following the election. If we were disembodied reasoning creatures who were only interested in the issues and policy, but we're not that. We're human beings. We like story, and this is a ripping good story. So I wish everybody, none of us, I suspect, are going to be that thrilled by what comes out of the election. So let's get as much fun out of the election process itself as we possibly can.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.